The planet Varus 9 was a peaceful and beautiful world. Its sky shimmered with soft silver clouds, and great green oceans surrounded floating cities built from crystal and steel. For centuries, the people of Varus 9 had known nothing but peace. They were artists, scientists, and dreamers who believed war belonged to the dark ages of history. Their place in the galaxy was quiet and respected, and they trusted that the alliances they had built would protect them if danger ever came. But peace often hides the shadow of war. One morning before the sun had fully risen, the warning sirens began to scream across the capital. From the outer colonies came frantic messages. The Korth Dominion had arrived. The Korth were not known for mercy. They were conquerors, a race that saw weakness as a reason to destroy. Their ships darkened the stars, massive black vessels armed with weapons that could melt continents. Within hours, their fleet surrounded Varus 9 like a noose tightening around a throat. Panic spread quickly. The Varisian Defense Council tried to organize resistance, but their fleets were small, built for exploration and science, not battle. The first wave of Korth strikes burned through orbital stations, shattered communication satellites, and silenced entire continents. Families ran for underground shelters as the sound of bombardment echoed across cities that had never known fear. People who once painted and composed symphonies now grabbed their children and prayed to survive another hour. In the control chamber of the capital's defense tower, Commander Elira Venn watched the chaos unfold on her screens. Her hands trembled as red markers blinked out one by one, each representing a destroyed ship, a lost life. "Send the distress call," she ordered. Her voice was steady, though her heart felt like it was breaking. "All frequencies. Send to every ally in the Galactic Concord. We need help now." Technicians rushed to comply. An SOS signal, encoded with Varus 9's coordinates, shot into the void. It carried a desperate message. Under attack by Korth Dominion. Civilian casualties massive. Requesting immediate aid from allied fleets. The message repeated over and over, bouncing from relay to relay, echoing across the stars. The Varisians waited. They believed their allies would come quickly. After all, they had signed the Concord Treaty centuries ago. That treaty promised protection to any member world facing unprovoked attack. Varus 9 had contributed resources, art, and technology to the Concord for generations. Surely, they thought, that loyalty would be returned. Surely someone would come. Hours passed, then days. The skies remained filled only with the enemy. The Korth kept advancing, crushing every defense line, burning forests, and seizing cities. Refugees filled the last remaining safe zones. Elira stood before her officers, her eyes hollow. "Any word from the Concord?" she asked quietly. "None, Commander," replied a young officer. "No transmissions. No fleets, nothing." For the first time in centuries, Varus 9 realized how alone it truly was. The allies they had trusted were silent, perhaps too afraid or too far away to intervene. The SOS kept transmitting, drifting farther into the darkness of space, maybe to be lost forever. Outside the capital, the enemy ships moved closer. The people could see them now, giant black specks against the sky. Every explosion made the ground shake. The once bright city lights dimmed as power grids failed. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. Children clung to their parents, asking questions no one could answer. The air smelled of smoke and fear. Elira looked out over her broken world and whispered, "Is this how we end?" But somewhere, light years away in the cold void between stars, her SOS reached unexpected ears. On a distant relay station near the edge of human-controlled space, a technician named Jacob Thorne sat half asleep at his console. The night shift was quiet. He was used to filtering out the endless stream of random signals, static pirate transmissions or broken messages from old probes. Then something strange flickered on his screen. A distress call. The code was old, not from any human network. He listened closer. The words were filled with static, but one phrase stood out clearly. "Under attack by Korth Dominion." Requesting immediate aid. Jacob frowned. "Varus 9?" he muttered. He checked the galactic maps. That planet was far outside human territory, deep in conquered space. It wasn't their concern. But something about the desperation in the voice made him forward the signal up the chain. Within an hour, the message reached the command deck of the Terran Defense Fleet. Admiral Rhea Corrin, a stern woman with gray eyes and battle scars, listened in silence. When it ended, her officers exchanged uncertain looks. "Admiral," one said carefully, "that call wasn't meant for us." It was directed to the conquered. Interfering could violate jurisdiction. Rhea leaned back in her chair. Jurisdiction? She repeated softly. A planet is being wiped out and you want to talk about jurisdiction? Her tone left no room for argument. Prepare a detachment. We move within the hour. The order raced through the fleet. Engines roared to life. Hangars opened and human warships emerged from their docks like sleeping beasts awakened. The Endurance, Dauntless Horizon, and the medical frigate Solace jumped into hyperspace, their course set straight for Varus 9. Back on Varus 9, the sky had turned black with enemy fire. Elira stood in the last command bunker, surrounded by flickering lights and wounded soldiers. Every heartbeat felt like the final one. Then suddenly a sensor operator gasped. Commander, multiple warp signatures incoming? Everyone froze. For a second, hope flared. But it quickly died when they realized the signatures didn't match conquered codes. Elira's heart sank. Who is it? She asked. The operator hesitated. Unknown origin. Wait, reading identification codes now. It's human, Commander. They're from Earth. The room fell silent. Even amid the chaos, people exchanged uncertain looks. Earth, the death world? The word carried both awe and fear. The galaxy knew stories of humans, how they evolved on a planet filled with predators, toxins, and violent storms. A world where survival meant constant struggle. The other species respected humans, but they also feared them. The nickname Deathworlders wasn't an insult. It was a warning. Elira took a deep breath. Open a channel, she said. A moment later, a voice came through the static. Calm, confident, unmistakably human. This is Captain Mara Vance of the Terran Defense Fleet, it said. We received your SOS. We're here to help. The words were simple, but to the Varisians they sounded like salvation. Elira felt tears sting her eyes. You came, she whispered. We did, Mara replied. Now show us where you need us most. High above Varus 9, the black of space lit up as the human ships broke formation and dove into battle. The Korth ships shifted to meet them, confident in their numbers. They didn't expect the ferocity that came next. The first human salvos struck like thunder. Railgun rounds tore through Korth shields and plasma fire burned across their hulls. The smaller human destroyers moved like predators, darting in, hitting hard, vanishing before the enemy could lock on. From the ground, the Varisians watched in awe as bright trails of light crossed the night sky. It was like seeing stars fight for them. For the first time in days, hope returned to Varus 9. People came out of hiding, pointing upward, cheering through their tears. The invincible Korth were falling back, confused and disoriented. The humans fought with a kind of controlled madness, reckless yet precise. They didn't fight for glory or conquest. They fought because someone had called for help. Down in the bunker, Elira watched the battle feed, her hands trembling again, but this time from disbelief. The Deathworlders had come when no one else did. Against all odds, against reason itself, humanity had answered a call that wasn't even meant for them. Above the burning skies of Varus 9, humanity's ships burned brighter still. Their message was written not in words but in fire. If you cry for help, they will come. Even if the whole galaxy turns away. The human ships came out of hyperspace like streaks of light tearing through the blackness. They were not huge or countless like the Korth Dominion fleet, but the way they moved carried purpose and fearlessness. The Varisians who watched from the surface felt both awe and disbelief. They had heard so many stories about the humans, the Deathworlders, creatures born on a planet where storms could tear apart cities and even the plants had ways to kill. No one could imagine what kind of people such a world would create. Now they were seeing the answer with their own eyes. The lead ship, the Dauntless, positioned itself between the burning Varisian capital and the oncoming Korth assault line. The human commander, Captain Mara Vance, stood tall on her bridge. Her eyes were sharp, her jaw firm, but her voice remained calm. Target the nearest Korth cruiser. Use railguns, save the plasma for later, she said. Her crew responded instantly. They had fought wars before, but this one felt different. This wasn't their fight, yet somehow it mattered deeply to them. Down on the surface, Commander Elira Venn watched from her bunker as the human ships faced the enemy fleet head-on. There are only 4 ships, she whispered, unable to believe it. 4 against hundreds. The tactical screens showed flashes of light where the two forces clashed. The Korth fired first, sending waves of plasma and missile fire across the void. The humans didn't run or retreat. Instead, they accelerated straight into the storm. The first Korth ship exploded within minutes. Human railguns punched through its armor like knives through paper. Their ships moved unpredictably, darting between explosions and debris. Every maneuver looked suicidal, yet somehow they survived. The Varisians watched in stunned silence. They had seen other fleets fight before, disciplined, cautious, measured. But the humans fought with emotion. It was as if each of them carried the pain of every world that had ever been left alone to die. Inside the Dauntless, alarms blared and the hull shook, but Captain Vance didn't flinch. "Keep firing," she ordered. "They'll break before we do." Her crew obeyed without hesitation. None of them spoke about fear. They didn't need to. They all knew what it meant to stand between the helpless and destruction. After an hour, the sky over Varus 9 looked like a storm of light. Wreckage rained down, burning through the atmosphere. From the ground it looked like stars falling from heaven. The Varisians who had been hiding underground began to peek out. Children pointed upward at the glowing trails, their eyes wide. "The Deathworlders are fighting for us," someone whispered. The word spread through the shelters like wildfire. But the humans hadn't come only to fight. The medical frigate Solace descended through the smoke and landed near the ruins of the capital. Its crew rushed out immediately, medics in gray suits with the blue Terran insignia on their shoulders. They didn't ask who was friend or alien. They just ran toward the injured. They lifted Varisian civilians from the rubble, wrapped their wounds, and carried them to safety. One Varisian doctor stood frozen as a human medic pushed a supply crate toward him and said, "No time to stare, friend. Start working." The alien nodded, amazed. He had heard humans were ruthless, but he saw only compassion in their faces. Above them, the battle raged on. The Korth began regrouping, trying to surround the human fleet. "They're adapting," said the Dauntless's tactical officer. "If they close the formation, we'll be trapped." Captain Vance thought for a second, then smiled. "Then let's trap them first." She sent a coded signal to the other ships. The human destroyers broke formation and dove toward the planet, pretending to retreat. The Korth fleet followed, believing they had finally scared the Deathworlders away. But the humans weren't running. They were luring them into the upper atmosphere where Varisian anti-air defenses still had power left. At the right moment, Captain Vance shouted, "Now!" And every Varisian cannon on the surface lit up. Together, humans and Varisians turned the sky into fire. The Korth ships that followed too deep into the planet's gravity well were torn apart by concentrated fire. The Varisians cheered as burning Korth wrecks fell into the oceans below. For the first time since the invasion began, the defenders of Varus 9 saw victory within reach. Down in the bunker, Elira Venn stood silent, watching. She could barely breathe. Every time a human ship took a hit, her heart stopped. These strangers from a faraway world were risking everything for her people, for a call that wasn't even meant for them. When a transmission came through the comms, she answered immediately. Captain Vance appeared on the screen, sweat on her forehead but a faint smile on her face. "Your anti-air batteries did good work," she said. "Let's make it count. We'll hold the skies while you regroup your ground forces." Elira saluted instinctively. "You're incredible," she said softly. "We didn't think anyone would come." Mara's smile faded into something gentler. "We almost didn't, but we heard you. And when someone cries for help, we come. That's what humans do." Those words stayed with Elira long after the connection ended. She repeated them quietly to herself like a prayer. When someone cries for help, we come. As the day turned to night, the Varisians began to organize under the guidance of human advisors. The humans shared tactics, helped repair communication lines, and taught the soldiers how to use terrain and surprise rather than pure force. Their methods were strange and dangerous. Ambushes, traps, silent night operations, but they worked. The Varisians started to fight like humans, desperate, clever, relentless. Meanwhile, Captain Vance's fleet kept holding the line in orbit. Every hour brought new Korth reinforcements, but the humans refused to give ground. They fought until their ammunition ran low, then switched to ramming maneuvers. When one Korth cruiser tried to strike the medical frigate, a human destroyer moved into its path and took the hit instead. The explosion lit up the sky. The Dauntless's crew watched the destruction in silence. Someone whispered, "They didn't die for nothing." Captain Vance only said, "No, they didn't. Now let's make sure no one else does either." On the surface, People started telling stories about the humans even before the battle was over. Some said their soldiers had eyes that glowed like stars when they fought. Others said their blood ran hotter than fire. Children in shelters made paper drawings of their ships and called them sky warriors. Fear had turned into admiration. The word Deathworlder no longer sounded frightening. It sounded noble. In the middle of the night, after another wave of attacks, Elira stood outside the command post looking at the smoke-filled horizon. Beside her stood a human marine, his armor scorched and dented. He offered her a ration pack. "Eat," he said simply. She took it and looked at him curiously. "You fight so hard," she said. "Even though this isn't your planet," the Marine shrugged. "Doesn't matter whose planet it is. People are people." He looked at the burning sky. "Back home we learned that if you wait for someone else to help, you'll die waiting. So we help each other, always." Elira said nothing, but his words, like the captain's earlier, sank deep into her heart. By dawn, the Korth fleet had pulled back temporarily to regroup. The Varisian sky was quieter, though filled with smoke and debris. The humans didn't celebrate. They simply began repairs, tending to the wounded and preparing for the next wave. To them, this wasn't a victory yet. It was just another fight to survive. But for the Varisians, everything had changed. They had witnessed something extraordinary: courage that defied logic, kindness from strangers, and strength born from compassion. They understood now why the galaxy both feared and respected the Deathworlders. They fought like beasts, but their hearts were human. When the sun rose over the scarred capital, Elira stood on a rooftop watching the human ships glint in the distance. The light made them look like guardians, shining protectors standing watch over a broken world. For the first time since the invasion began, she allowed herself to hope. The humans had come for no reward, no treaty, no promise. They came because someone had cried out for help, and that was reason enough. Varys 9 would never forget that moment. In that fragile morning light, among smoke and ruin, a bond was formed. Not of blood or politics, but of something stronger. Humanity had answered the call, and in doing so, they had changed the fate of an entire world. The war on Varys 9 had entered a new stage. After days of brutal fighting in orbit, the Korth Dominion realized they could not win the skies easily. Their ships had suffered heavy losses from the human fleet, but they were far from defeated. Instead of retreating, they changed tactics. Thousands of troop carriers began dropping through the atmosphere, their black hulls burning red as they entered the planet's gravity. The ground war was about to begin. The Varisians, exhausted and broken, watched the falling dropships with despair. They had lost most of their defenses, and their cities were already half in ruins. Commander Elira Venn stood on the observation deck of the capital's command tower, her uniform torn and dusty. "They're landing everywhere," she said quietly, her eyes filled with dread. "We can't hold them." But beside her stood Captain Mara Vance, calm as ever. She looked at the incoming enemy signals and simply said, "Then we don't hold them. We fight them differently." The humans had seen wars like this before. They knew how to fight when outnumbered and outgunned. Within hours, human marines began deploying across the planet, landing in squads beside Varisian defense groups. They carried strange weapons that hummed with power and armor, that looked like a second skin. Their faces were calm, but their eyes told a story of people who had already seen too much war and loss. One of the first battles happened in the ruins of Sarakai. Once a beautiful coastal city, now turned into a field of fire and dust. The Korth soldiers advanced in huge mechanical suits, towering over buildings, firing plasma cannons that melted the streets. The Varisian defenders tried to hold their ground but were quickly overwhelmed. Then from the smoke came the humans. A dozen Marines moved like shadows through the debris. Their commander, Sergeant Cole Ramirez, raised his rifle and signaled to his squad. "We go in quiet," he said. "No hero stuff. We hit hard, we vanish." They slipped through broken buildings, planting explosives along the Korth supply lines. Within minutes, a chain of explosions ripped through the enemy ranks, throwing metal and fire into the air. The Varisians, watching from cover, couldn't believe what they were seeing. The humans didn't fight in straight lines or follow traditional orders. They used everything, shadows, sound, chaos itself, as weapons. When one of their own was wounded, they didn't retreat. They carried him while still firing back, refusing to leave anyone behind. The Varisians soon learned that humans had a saying, "No one gets left behind." They lived by it. Even when it meant walking into death. As the war dragged on, strange friendships began to form. Human engineers taught Varisian soldiers how to adapt their weapons, making them lighter and more deadly. Human medics trained alien doctors to perform fast battlefield surgeries. They worked day and night, rarely sleeping, driven by something deeper than orders, a need to protect life. There was one moment that spread across the entire planet like a legend. During the Battle of the Central Spire, the Korth unleashed a massive war machine, a walking fortress taller than any building, armed with plasma cannons capable of burning through mountains. It began moving toward the last refugee camp, where thousands of civilians were hiding. The Varisian defenses had no power left to stop it. Captain Mara Vance from her ship above saw the danger and gave an impossible order. "Bring the Dauntless lower. We'll take the shot ourselves." Her officers looked at her in shock. "Ma'am, if we enter the atmosphere at that angle," one began, but she cut him off. "If that machine reaches the camp, it's over. Do it." The Dauntless roared down through the clouds, its hull glowing red from re-entry heat. The Korth fortress turned its guns upward, firing blast after blast, but the human ship kept coming. At the last second, it released a barrage of railgun rounds, punching straight through the machine's armor and detonating its reactor. The explosion was so bright it lit the sky like a second sun. The Dauntless barely pulled up in time, its hull scorched and battered. From the ground, the Varisians saw the human ship hovering above them like a guardian angel. Cheers broke out. Children pointed to the sky and shouted, "The Deathworlders saved us!" The humans didn't answer the praise. They simply went back to work, rescuing the wounded and preparing for the next attack. But the cost was high. Many human soldiers didn't survive those days. In the ruins of Sarakai, Sergeant Ramirez and half his team were killed holding a bridge so that civilians could escape. When Elira visited the site later, she found a Varisian child holding a piece of Ramirez's insignia, tears in her eyes. "He said we were family now," the girl whispered. Elira couldn't stop her own tears. Everywhere the humans went, they left the same impression, not of power but of humanity. They fought like demons when needed, but their kindness was just as fierce. After every battle, they shared their rations with the Varisians. They helped rebuild shelters, carried the wounded, and buried the dead, both human and alien. At night, around the fires, Varisian soldiers would ask them questions. "Why do you risk so much for us?" One young officer asked a human named Corporal Nia Tran. The woman smiled faintly and said, "Because someone has to. Back home, we learned what happens when no one comes to help. We won't let that happen again." As days turned into weeks, the Korth's confidence began to crack. Their commanders couldn't understand how such a small force could keep fighting so effectively. The humans were unpredictable. They struck from nowhere, disappeared into ruins, then hit again from behind. One Korth report described them as mad creatures that do not fear death. They didn't realize the truth. The humans did fear death. They just refused to let it stop them. Elira fought beside them more and more, learning their ways. She stopped giving long, cautious orders and began to trust her instincts. Under human guidance, the Varisian forces transformed. They became fast, clever, and determined. For the first time, the Korth were pushed back from key positions. But it wasn't only tactics that changed, and it was hearts. The Varisians, who once thought of humans as dangerous beasts from a cursed world, now saw them differently. They saw how a human soldier would run into burning rubble just to save a crying child. They saw engineers giving away their oxygen masks to wounded strangers. They saw captains staying awake for 3 days straight, refusing to sleep until everyone was accounted for. On the 10th day of fighting, a massive Korth offensive struck the northern sector. Elira led a combined Varisian human team to defend it. The fighting was brutal. Plasma fire turned night into day. The air was thick with smoke and screams. At one point, a Korth shell hit close to Elira, knocking her down. When she opened her eyes, she saw a human Marine covering her with his body, shielding her from the blast. He was dead. His armor cracked, but his arm still held her protectively. She stared at him for a long time, unable to move. That moment burned into her soul. By the time the sun rose again, the battlefield was quiet. The humans and Varisians had held the line. Smoke drifted across the fields, carrying the smell of burnt metal and victory. Elira looked around at the survivors, tired, wounded, but still standing. She thought of the human words she had heard before. No one gets left behind. Now she understood them fully. Up above, the human ships continued to fight reinforcements trying to break through. Communication between the ground and orbit was filled with static. But the voices that came through carried the same strength, the same determination. "We're still here," Captain Vance said through the radio. "And we're not leaving until you're safe." For the people of Varus 9, those words meant everything. They had seen their allies abandon them, but these strangers had stayed. They had lost ships, friends, and lives, yet they kept fighting as if Varus 9 were their own home. By the end of the third week, the Korth were bleeding. Their forces began retreating from key regions, their morale broken. The Varisians could hardly believe it. They looked to the humans who stood among the ruins, covered in dust and blood, and saw something they could never forget. These weren't monsters from a death world. They were saviors with hearts made of fire and compassion. Elira stood on a cliff one evening, watching the sunset over the damaged city. Beside her stood Captain Mara Vance, silent, her uniform stained with soot. Elira said softly, "We could never have survived this without you." Mara looked at her and smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you fought too. You stood your ground. That's what matters." Elira shook her head. "No, what matters is that you came. When no one else did." Mara looked up at the sky where the stars were beginning to appear and said, "That's what we do. We answer the call. Always." And in that fading light, amid the ruins of their world, the Varisians realized that the Deathworlders' true power wasn't their weapons or their strength. It was their humanity. The courage to fight, to protect, and to care when everyone else had given up. The war had dragged on for weeks, and Varus 9 was scarred beyond recognition. Once beautiful cities were now only piles of blackened steel and broken stone. The oceans glowed faintly with debris from the battle above, and smoke covered most of the planet's sky. Yet even in this destruction there was still life, and still hope. The humans and Varisians had fought side by side, and against all odds they had survived. But everyone knew the fight wasn't over. The Korth Dominion had suffered great losses, but they were not the kind of enemy to give up easily. They were regrouping. Captain Mara Vance stood on the bridge of her damaged ship, the Dauntless, looking at the faint light of Varus 9 through the viewport. The ship's hull was covered in burns and holes, its systems half-functional, but her crew refused to stop. "They'll be back," her tactical officer said grimly. "Their main fleet hasn't even arrived yet." Mara nodded slowly. "Then we get ready," she said. "We don't run. We hold." On the planet below, Commander Elira Venn was rebuilding her command post with the help of human engineers. Every day more wounded arrived, but so did volunteers. Farmers, scientists, and students joined the defense lines. They were no longer waiting for rescue. They had become fighters. Elira watched them and felt a strange sense of pride mixed with fear. "They shouldn't have to do this," she said quietly. Beside her stood Corporal Nia Tran, one of the human Marines. Her armor was scratched, her face tired, but her voice carried steady confidence. "They shouldn't," Nia said, "but they are. That's what courage looks like." That night, sensors picked up movement beyond the system's edge. The Korth were coming again, and this time their numbers were terrifying. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands of fighters and carriers filled with reinforcements. The message from their flagship was simple and cruel. Varus 9 will burn. The humans and Varisians prepared for what felt like the final battle. The ground troops reinforced choke points, and civilians were evacuated to the underground shelters. Every gun, every turret, every soldier was ready. Still, deep down, Elira knew their chances were slim. When she looked up at the sky, she could see the faint glows of the human ships moving into defensive positions, like lonely stars against the darkness. Inside the Dauntless, Captain Vance recorded a message and sent it to Earth. "This is Captain Mara Vance," she began quietly. "If you receive this, know that we're holding Varus 9 as long as we can. If we fall, make sure the galaxy remembers why they should have feared us, and not for our strength, but for what we stood for." She ended the message and looked around at her crew. None of them spoke, but their faces showed no fear. They knew what was coming. When the Korth fleet arrived, it was like watching a storm swallow the stars. Their ships blotted out the light, their weapons glowed with deadly energy. The first volley struck hard, shaking the human and Varisian defenses. Explosions rippled across orbit and communication lines flickered. The human ships responded instantly. The Dauntless led the charge, firing railguns and torpedoes into the enemy formation. One Korth destroyer exploded, then another, but the numbers kept coming. On the ground, the shockwaves from the orbital battle rattled buildings and shattered windows. The people could see streaks of light flashing across the sky, each one a deadly exchange between fleets. Elira stood in the control room, trying to coordinate defenses. "Tell the humans we're ready on the surface," she said. "We'll hold as long as they do." And then something unexpected happened. The human reinforcements arrived. From the far edge of the system, massive hyperspace gates burst open and new ships emerged. Dozens at first, then hundreds. The full Terran battle group had come. The flagship Endurance led the formation, its hull shining like silver fire. The voice of Admiral Rhea Corrin echoed through every frequency. "This is the Terran Defense Fleet. Hold your lines. Varus 9. You're not alone anymore." The sight of the human fleet filled every Varisian heart with renewed hope. Even the wounded stood and cheered. The humans had not abandoned them. They had brought their might, their fury, and their compassion to the edge of the galaxy. The second wave of the battle began. The Endurance launched hundreds of fighter squadrons, each weaving through the Korth formation like angry hornets. The skies turned into chaos, explosions, debris, and fire stretching across the heavens. The Dauntless, though damaged, fought beside its sister ships, shielding the weaker vessels and drawing enemy fire. Captain Vance's voice came over the radio. "For every life they tried to take, give them tenfold." Down below, the ground war reignited. Korth troops dropped across the continents, attacking cities and bunkers. Human Marines and Varisian soldiers met them head-on. The fighting was savage, hand-to-hand in the ruins of streets that once held music and laughter. Plasma fire lit the darkness, and smoke made it hard to breathe, but no one gave up. Elira fought beside the soldiers now, not behind a desk. She carried a rifle given to her by a human officer and fired until her arm shook. Around her, humans and Varisians covered each other, saving each other's lives without hesitation. In one moment, when a Korth mech stormed through the barricades, a human pilot crashed his damaged dropship into it, sacrificing himself to protect the soldiers below. The explosion rocked the city, and everyone stared in stunned silence. Elira whispered, "They fight like they don't know how to stop." Above them, the Endurance faced the Korth flagship. The battle between the two giants shook the void. The Korth ship launched a superweapon beam, cutting through space like a spear of light. The Endurance's shield shattered, and the bridge filled with alarms. Admiral Corrin stood tall and said, "Target their reactor. Full power." Her crew obeyed without hesitation. The human dreadnought's cannons charged, glowing white-hot. With a single massive blast, they pierced the Korth flagship straight through. The explosion that followed could be seen from the surface of Varus 9. When the flagship fell, the rest of the Korth fleet began to scatter. Their command structure was broken, their morale shattered. The humans pursued them, driving them out of the system. For the first time in living memory, the Korth Dominion retreated. On the planet, silence finally returned. The Varisians came out from their shelters, blinking at the light breaking through the smoke-filled sky. The surviving humans landed their ships, some of them damaged beyond repair but still flying. Captain Vance stepped off her transport, her armor covered in soot and burns. Elira met her on the ground. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Elira said softly, "You did it." "You saved us." Mara shook her head. "We all did," she replied. "You fought. We just stood beside you." The battlefield around them was filled with both sorrow and relief. There were bodies to bury, fires to put out, and lives to heal. The humans didn't celebrate victory with cheers or pride. They simply began working, helping the wounded, clearing debris, and building shelters for civilians. Their faces were tired, but their hands never stopped moving. That night, when the fires had finally died down, Elira stood with Captain Vance on a hill overlooking the capital. The stars were visible again, faint but steady. "When your fleet arrived," Elira said quietly, "I thought it was the end, but it was the beginning of something else." Mara looked at the horizon. "We didn't come for glory," she said. "We came because someone asked for help. That's what humanity is. We can't ignore a cry in the dark." The wind blew softly through the ruined fields. Somewhere in the distance, the surviving Varisian children were lighting lanterns and releasing them into the sky. Tiny lights floating upward, symbols of remembrance for those who had fallen. The humans watched silently, some smiling, others wiping away tears. As the lanterns rose higher, Elira felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: peace. She realized the humans hadn't just saved their planet. They had given them something far more valuable: They had shown them that courage and compassion could exist together, that kindness could be stronger than fear. The war for Varus 9 was over. The cost had been terrible, but the victory was real. The Deathworlders, feared by the galaxy, had come not as conquerors but as protectors, and in the quiet that followed, their ships floated like silent guardians above the world they had saved, their lights shining down through the smoke and clouds like the gaze of angels watching over a reborn world. Years later, Varus 9 was no longer the broken world it once was. The cities that had been shattered by war were rebuilt with care and unity. The new capital gleamed under the twin suns, a blend of alien design and human engineering. Tall silver spires rose beside domed crystal halls, and every building told a story of survival. The streets that had once echoed with explosions now carried laughter, trade, and music from both species. But even as peace returned, no one forgot what had happened. Every brick and every scarred piece of metal held a memory of the war, of the courage that had saved them when all hope was gone. In the center of the capital stood something that drew people from across the galaxy, a monument. It was not grand because of its size, but because of its meaning. Half of it was built from Varisian stone, carved with delicate symbols of unity. The other half was forged from human steel, rough and unpolished, strong and unyielding. At the center, the two halves met, sculpted into a pair of hands clasping each other, one human, one Varisian. At the base, an inscription read, "They came not for conquest, but for compassion." People came from distant worlds to see it. Veterans would stand in silence before it, remembering friends who never came home. Children from both races ran around it, unaware of how much pain and sacrifice had made their laughter possible. And in the evenings, when the light faded, the monument glowed softly as if alive, powered by both alien and human energy, a symbol of everything they had built together. Captain Mara Vance visited often, though she was no longer in uniform. Her hair had turned silver, and her once steady hands now trembled slightly from old injuries. She would stand at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed, looking at the monument. Sometimes she would whisper the names of her crew, the ones who had given everything. She didn't stay long. She never liked attention, and she believed the monument was for the fallen, not the living. Still, every time she came, she left a small object at its base, a rusted insignia from her ship. The dauntless Commander Elira Venn had become the first minister of Varus 9. She was older now, too, her scales a softer hue than before, but her eyes still held the same spark. Under her leadership, the planet had become a center of peace and learning. Varisian scientists and human engineers worked side by side, creating new technologies and teaching others that cooperation was more powerful than fear. Elira often told her students that the universe had changed the day humanity answered their SOS. Not because of the battle, but because of what followed. "They didn't just save us," she said. "They showed us who we could be." The story of Varus 9 spread far beyond its borders. Across the stars, civilizations that once feared humans began to see them differently. The word Deathworlder had once meant something terrifying, a creature from a deadly planet shaped by hardship, dangerous and unpredictable. But after Varus 9, that word changed. Now when people spoke of the Deathworlders, they spoke with respect, even awe. They were no longer seen as monsters, but as protectors, beings who had endured the harshest worlds and yet still chose to be kind. There were countless retellings of the story. Some turned it into legend, others taught it in schools. On distant planets, children would reenact the moment the human fleet arrived, shouting the famous line, "Hold your lines, Varus 9, you're not alone anymore." Even those who had never met a human began to understand what they represented, the courage to care when no one else would. Admiral Rhea Corrin, who had commanded the Terran fleet, passed away a decade later. Her funeral was held in orbit over Earth, attended by representatives from dozens of species, including Varisians. Elira herself spoke there, her voice trembling as she recalled the battle. "When we cried out for help, you came," she said softly. "Not for power, not for conquest, but because it was right. You reminded us that compassion is not weakness, it's strength." Her words were broadcast across the galaxy, and millions listened. Back on Varus 9, the monument remained, untouched by time. It became a sacred place not of worship, but of remembrance. Each year on the anniversary of the battle, lights filled the sky. Thousands of small ships flew in formation, their trails glowing in the dark like stars being reborn. Veterans from both species would march through the streets, not as soldiers but as brothers and sisters united by what they had survived. And every time the crowd went silent, someone would read the inscription aloud, a promise that no one would forget. One night, long after the celebrations had ended, Elira returned to the monument alone. She stood in the quiet plaza, the twin moons casting soft light over the metal and stone. As she placed her hand on the cold surface, she thought of all those she had lost, friends, soldiers, strangers who had become family. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You came when we needed you." Her reflection shimmered in the steel, and for a moment she imagined she saw another figure beside her, Mara Vance, smiling quietly. Elira smiled back, though she knew it was only her memory playing tricks. Still, she liked to believe that those who had fought were still watching over them, somewhere among the stars. Generations passed. The children of humans and Varisians grew up together. Some even shared bloodlines, their features a blend of both species, their languages mixed into new dialects. They didn't think of each other as different anymore. To them, the war was a distant story, something from history books. But every once in a while, they would visit the monument and listen to the recordings preserved in its base. Real voices from the war. The voices of soldiers, pilots, and medics. They could hear Captain Vance giving orders during the final battle, her tone steady and fierce. They could hear the chaos of the battlefield, the cries for help and the calm replies of those who refused to abandon anyone. And at the end, they heard the same simple words that had come to define an entire generation. "We came because someone asked for help." One young boy, a half-human, half-Varisian child, asked his teacher one day, "Why did they help us? They didn't even know us." The teacher smiled and answered, "That's exactly why. Because sometimes the greatest kind of strength is helping someone you've never met." The boy thought for a moment and then nodded. "Then we should be like them," he said. And in that simple reply lay the true legacy of the Deathworlders. Not in war, not in victory, but in the idea that kindness could ripple across stars and generations. The galaxy changed because of what happened on Varus 9. Alliances formed between species that had once been enemies. Trade routes opened, knowledge was shared, and for the first time in centuries there was real peace, fragile but precious. Of course, there were still those who hated or feared humans, who called them dangerous. But even they could not deny the truth that Varus 9 had proven. That humanity's strength did not come from its weapons or its fierce worlds, but from its heart. And somewhere far beyond the galactic rim, in the quiet dark between the stars, old ships drifted silently, relics of the war. Their hulls bore the names of those who had fallen, their lights flickering faintly like eternal beacons. Travelers who passed through those regions sometimes reported hearing faint transmissions like echoes, voices of old soldiers, repeating fragments of that fateful battle. Some said it was just interference. Others liked to believe it was something more. The ghosts of the Deathworlders still watching, still guarding, ready to answer another cry for help if one ever came. The story of Varus 9 became more than history. It became a reminder that no matter how dark the universe became, there would always be someone willing to stand in the light. The Deathworlders had shown that even those born in the harshest worlds could be the kindest souls. And though centuries would pass, and new wars would come and go, their legacy would endure, carved in stone and steel on a world once lost to despair. And as the stars shone above Varus 9 that night, the monument glowed softly once more, two hands clasped together, never letting go.